A woman walks into Parker Pyne's office with a diamond ring, claiming she's in danger. But the truth, it's even darker than you could imagine. It was a gray, unremarkable afternoon in London, the kind that slips by unnoticed, lost in a haze of drizzle and routine. Parker Pyne sat at his desk, idly flipping through a stack of correspondence, the dull hum of rain against the window pane the only companion to his thoughts. It was the kind of day when even mysteries seemed to take a rest. Then the door burst open. A woman stumbled in, dragging the storm with her. Her coat was drenched, her auburn curls clinging to her face, and in her trembling hand was a diamond ring, its brilliance a stark contrast to the shadows in her eyes. "Two need your help," she stammered, her voice cracking with desperation. Her gaze darted around the room as though she expected someone or something to follow her in. Parker Pyne rose slowly, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took her in. She wasn't just anxious, she was terrified. Women of her station didn't barge into offices unannounced, rain-soaked and wild-eyed, unless they were running from something for someone. "Sit down," he said firmly, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. She hesitated for a moment, then sank into it as though her legs could no longer support her. The ring in her hand caught the light, scattering tiny rainbows across the walls. "It's all gone wrong," she murmured, clutching it so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I thought I could fix it on my own, but now—" Her words caught in her throat, and she glanced over her shoulder at the closed door. Pyne leaned forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Start from the beginning, Mrs. St. John," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "Daphne St. John." She paused, her lips trembling, before finally meeting his gaze. "And if I don't fix this, I don't know what will happen to me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. Pyne waited, letting the silence draw her out. "I stole this ring," she blurted, thrusting it forward as though it burned her. "And if anyone finds out, it'll ruin me. My marriage, my reputation, everything." Pyne's brows lifted, but he said nothing, his practiced silence encouraging her to continue. "It's not just the ring," she added, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's what it means, what I've done, what they know." She leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "I am being watched, Mr. Pyne. I can feel it. Please, you have to help me." Outside, the rain lashed harder against the window, as though the storm itself had taken an interest in her plight. Pyne studied her for a moment longer before finally speaking. "All right, Mrs. St. John," he said softly, his voice steady as a lighthouse in the gale. "Let's untangle this mess, shall we?" And with that, the ordinary afternoon dissolved into a labyrinth of lies, danger, and betrayal, with Parker Pyne stepping into the eye of the storm. Daphne's fingers trembled as she set the diamond ring down on the desk between them, its polished surface catching the light in a way that almost felt like mockery. She stared at it for a long moment, her breath shallow and uneven, before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lady Naomi Dortheimer," she began, the name falling from her lips like a curse, "is my friend, or at least I thought she was." She forced herself to look up, meeting Pyne's gaze. "I've done something terrible, Mr. Pyne. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of guilt and fear, and for a moment it seemed as though the words would fail her. Pyne leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanged but his mind already piecing together the puzzle. He had seen desperation like this before, but it was never less striking, never less dangerous. "I took this ring," Daphne continued, her voice shaking as she clasped her hands tightly together. "I took it from Naomi. I swapped it out with a paste copy and pawned the real one to pay off some debts." There it was, the secret that had been eating at her for weeks, the lie that had spiraled out of control. Pyne watched as she gulped down a breath, her eyes darting nervously around the room, as though she expected someone to burst in at any second. "I had no choice," she muttered, her voice suddenly hoarse. "The gambling started as a bit of fun, but then it took over. My husband has no idea. Naomi doesn't know. Nobody knows. But I am drowning, Mr. Pyne. drowning in my own mistakes. The silence that followed her confession was thick, suffocating even. Pyne's mind clicked into motion, running through the possibilities, the dangers, the webs of deceit now entangling the young woman before him. "Why the ring?" Pyne asked, his voice level, but his eyes sharp. "Why not something else?" Her lips trembled as she answered, "Because it was Naomi's most prized possession, a gift from her late husband. I knew it would be easy to pawn, and I needed the money quickly more than I'd ever admit to anyone. It seemed like the perfect solution." She ran her fingers through her hair, eyes wide, as though the pressure of the truth was suffocating her. "But now I can't return it. Naomi's husband and mine, that here has been a falling out. They don't speak, they don't even look at each other anymore. And Naomi is furious with me. If she finds out what I've done, it will be the end of everything. My marriage, my life, it's all hanging by a thread." Pyne sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he absorbed the gravity of the situation. Daphne was trapped not just by her actions, but by a network of lies, betrayals, and a friendship that seemed to be falling apart at the seams. "But you have a way out, don't you?" Pyne's voice cut through the tension, calm and measured. "You wouldn't be here asking for help if you didn't." Her eyes flickered with something, hope, maybe, or desperation, or both. "I thought I could get the ring back, but it's too dangerous now. Naomi wants to reset the diamond, and if that happens, the truth will be out. I can't risk it." She leaned forward, her voice barely audible, as though confessing her sins to the very air itself. "That's why I am here. You are my last hope, Mr. Pyne. Please, fix this for me." The air between them crackled with tension. Daphne's secrets were no longer just her own, they were now part of something larger, darker. The storm outside seemed to echo the chaos within her. Pyne considered her for a long moment, then stood up, walking to the window and gazing out at the rain-lashed streets below. The puzzle was starting to form in his mind, the pieces falling into place with a clarity that had eluded Daphne. But just as he was about to speak, the door creaked open, a subtle sound, almost imperceptible, but enough to make both their hearts race. Daphne's eyes snapped to the door, her breath caught in her throat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Pyne turned slowly, his face as unreadable as ever. "You are being watched, Mrs. St. John," he said quietly, as the door slowly clicked shut behind them. Daphne's blood ran cold. The feeling that had been gnawing at her, the sensation of eyes on her, of danger lurking just beyond her reach, was no longer a distant fear. It was here, in the room with them. The storm outside raged on, but inside the office, a different kind of storm was just beginning to brew. Web of deception. The silence in Pyne's office was deafening as Daphne slowly sank into the chair, her fingers gripping the armrests as though she could somehow steady herself against the storm inside her. The diamond ring, a symbol of her desperate gamble, glinted softly in the dim light of the room, but to Daphne, it felt like a weight, pulling her deeper into a pit of guilt she couldn't escape. She took a long, shaky breath before she spoke again, her words tumbling out in a rush, as though they were suffocating her from the inside. "I've been living a lie for months now, Mr. Pyne." Her voice trembled as she paused, eyes flicking nervously to the ring. "My husband, Georgie's a good man, a careful man. He has no idea what I've been doing." Pyne watched her carefully, his mind already processing every word she said. He knew there was more. There always was. Daphne's gaze dropped to her lap, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "I've been gambling, Mr. Pyne, more than I should. The casino in Le Touquet, the one with the glittering lights and the promises of easy fortune, it had me. At first it was just a way to unwind. A little fun, a little risk, nothing serious. But then it took over. I couldn't stop." She clenched her hands into fists, as though she were trying to contain the rage she felt toward herself. "I kept it hidden from George, from everyone. I'd tell him I was out shopping, or at a friend's house. But every night I was at that damn casino, betting what little money we had left." She swallowed hard, as though the admission physically hurt. I lost it all, Mr. Pyne. The money, the savings, even the small inheritance I had left from my father. Everything was gone. Pyne's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing that there was a deeper layer to this story, a deeper lie woven into the fabric of her confession. Daphne's voice faltered, but she pressed on. Then came Lady Naomi's ring, the one you see before you. She looked up at him, eyes filled with regret. It was the perfect solution. Naomi is so proud of that ring, her late husband's gift. She'd never part with it willingly, and I knew that. Daphne's lips twisted bitterly. So I swapped it. I found a perfect replica no one would ever know. I took the real diamond and pawned it in Paris. All that money gone in a single night. Pyne's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a clear picture. But just as quickly, another thought struck him. There was more to this than just gambling debts. Something else lingered beneath the surface, something Daphne wasn't saying. I am assuming that here is more to this story, Pyne said, his voice steady but probing. Why the sudden need to reclaim the ring now, after everything you've done? Daphne hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as though the answer could be found in the shadows. She exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. My cousin Edmundy passed away a month ago, and with his death, I've inherited a sum of money. Enough to pay off my debts, to reclaim the ring, and to make everything right. She clenched her hands together, her nails biting into her palms. But here is a problem. Naomi, she's suspicious. I can feel it. She knows something's off, but she can't prove it, and I can't return the ring now. Not after what I've done. She looked up at Pyne, her eyes pleading. I am trapped. The past is closing in on me, Mr. Pyne, and I don't know how to get out of it. A flicker of realization passed over Pyne's face. She had thought her cousin's inheritance would be the answer, but it had only complicated things further. Now she was tangled in a web of lies, not just about the ring, but about the very fabric of her life. And this isn't just about the money, is it? Pyne asked, his voice cutting through the tension. Here is more at stake here than you are willing to admit. Daphne's lips trembled as she looked away. You don't understand. It's not just the ring. Naomi and I are families, we've been through so much. I am afraid that if she finds out what I've done, everything will fall apart. She'll ruin me, Mr. Pyne. She'll expose me for the liar I am. She swallowed hard, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the wall. It seemed to echo louder with every passing second, amplifying the weight of her words. The pieces were falling into place, but Pyne knew that Daphne was still hiding something crucial. The question wasn't just about the ring anymore. It was about why she had gone so far to keep it hidden, why she couldn't bring herself to tell George the truth. I'll help you, Mrs. St. John, Pyne said finally, his voice calm but with an edge of something darker beneath it. But you need to tell me everything, no more secrets. Daphne's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded. The storm outside raged on, but the storm inside her seemed even more dangerous, more volatile. The deeper they went, the more she realized that there was no easy way out. She had stepped into a game where the stakes were much higher than she could have imagined, and the truth was the last thing anyone would want to uncover. The twist of the conflict. Daphne's hands trembled as she gripped the arms of the chair, her knuckles white. Pyne's office felt suffocating now, the air thick with unspoken secrets. She had told him most of the truth, perhaps too much, but there was still one final, horrifying layer that she had kept hidden. And it was this very layer that was pushing her toward a precipice she didn't know how to avoid. You don't understand, Mr. Pyne, Daphne said, her voice growing strained. I can't return the ring. Not now, not after what happened. Pyne leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. There was something more, something that still hadn't clicked in this increasingly tangled puzzle. Why? What's stopping you? She hesitated, her lips quivering as she met his gaze, but then she broke, her words tumbling out in a rushed whisper. My husband, George, and Lady Naomi's husband, Danielthe, had a falling out. A terrible one, over business, over something that neither of them will admit. It's been going on for months, and no one knows what caused it, only that it's so deep now, so bitter, that no one is willing to speak to the other. The confession hung in the air, but Daphne wasn't finished. Naomi doesn't even look at me the same way anymore. She knows I am hiding something, but she doesn't know what. Her hands wrung together, twisting as though they were still trying to undo the mess she had created. She's already suspicious. If I were to return that ring to her now, if she found out what I had done. She closed her eyes as if picturing it, the horrifying image too much to bear. Naomi will expose me. She'll tear my life apart. She'll never forgive me. Pyne watched her, his expression unreadable, but inside his mind raced. There was more here than just a simple case of theft. This was about far more than a diamond ring or debts at a casino. There were lives, reputations, and relationships hanging in the balance. Daphne's fear wasn't just about being caught. It was about the destruction of everything she had worked so hard to build. The ring, it's more than just a pawn in your debt, isn't it? Pyne said slowly, leaning back in his chair, his gaze sharp. It's tied to something far deeper. To these two families, to their business, something that can't be undone. Daphne's eyes flickered, her lips parting slightly as though she had been caught in a lie too big to swallow. I don't know what to do anymore, her voice broke. The money I had, it's not enough to fix everything. The debts are still there, and now this ring, this cursed ring, has trapped me. Naomi wants to reset it, make it hers again, and once she does, once she sees it's been tampered with, she'll... Her voice faltered. Pyne didn't interrupt. He allowed the silence to stretch on, letting Daphne unravel the knot of her own thoughts. She was spiraling, and he knew it. The pressure was mounting in a way that made the stakes higher than she even realized. I thought I could fix everything, that somehow I could right the wrongs, but the closer I get to returning it, the more impossible it feels. Naomi's eyes, they're watching me, Mr. Pyne. They see me, but I can't afford for her to see the truth. Not now. She stood abruptly, her face pale, her breath quickening. I need you to help me, please. Pyne considered her words carefully, then, after a long pause, spoke. So your only option is to find a way to keep the ring hidden, to make sure it never reaches Naomi. You want me to help you hide your crime permanently? Daphne's eyes glimmered with a mix of relief and fear. Yes, exactly. The room was heavy with the weight of her desperation, but the deeper Pyne dug, the clearer it became that the simple theft of a ring was just the beginning. The layers of deceit were suffocating, and the forces at play, business, family, betrayal, were too entangled to separate. This wasn't just a crime to be hidden away. It was the key to something far more dangerous, something that, if uncovered, would destroy everything. But Pyne was a man of solutions, and Daphne had made the right choice in seeking him out. However, as he leaned forward in his chair, his voice colder than before, he added, "But Daphne, to here is something you need to understand. If we don't get this right, if we don't hide everything, if we don't control every move, we may not just lose the ring. We'll lose everything." He let the weight of his words settle over her. Daphne's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Pyne's eyes narrowed. The question is not if we can hide it from Naomi. The question is who else is watching. And why did this ring, this stolen ring, bring you here to me? What will it cost us to keep this secret safe? Daphne's breath caught. She hadn't considered the danger of having Pyne involved. She'd come to him desperate for help, but she now realized just how deep this rabbit hole went. And then, before she could speak another word, Pyne stood and walked over to the window, looking out over the dimming streets of London. He turned back to her with an expression that could freeze the blood in one's veins. You think Naomi is the only problem. The danger isn't her, Daphne. It's someone far more dangerous, someone who has been watching us both. Daphne's heart skipped a beat. The walls seemed to close in. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Just then, a soft tap echoed on the door. The last thing Daphne saw was Pyne's calculating, gazy eyes, narrowing just slightly. He whispered, "We're out of time." The clever plan, Pyne's solution. The room fell silent as Pyne leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in that familiar, thoughtful pose. His eyes, which had seemed distant moments before, were now sharp with the kind of focused brilliance Daphne had heard about but never truly seen. The tension was palpable, but Pyne remained unshaken, as if the entire world could fall apart and he'd still find a way to make it right. "I understand your desperation, Mrs. St. John," Pyne said calmly, his voice steady but filled with the quiet certainty that only he could muster in such moments. "And I am afraid tea here is no easy way out. But then, that's where I come in." He gave her a slight, reassuring smile, a fleeting hint of a plan forming in his mind. Daphne's gaze flickered to him, her heart racing with uncertainty. "What do you mean? Do you have a solution?" Pyne didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his chair, a dramatic pause before the storm of his genius hit. His mind worked like a well-oiled machine, his every move calculated, his every word deliberate. He looked out the window, as though he were already envisioning the perfect outcome. "You see, the problem isn't simply the return of the ring, though that's problematic enough. The problem is how to do it without raising suspicion. If Naomi knows that the ring has been tampered with, everything unravels. What we need is a distraction, something so exquisite, so dazzling, that no one will notice what's happening right under their noses." Daphne blinked, unsure of where he was going with this, but Pyne was already lost in the web of his thoughts. "A distraction?" she asked, hesitant. "But how? Naomi is no fool. She'll see right through anything that doesn't fit with the scheme." "Ah," Pyne said with a sly smile, turning back to her. "But that's the beauty of it. We don't need a distraction, we need a performance, a spectacle. Something that will captivate everyone, distract them, and give us the perfect window of opportunity." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "And I have just the people for the job." He walked over to his desk, taking out a small, worn notebook, flipping it open to a page filled with names. His finger traced the lines before stopping. "Claude Luttrell and Madeleine de Serra, the finest dancers in London. Their performances are so captivating, so theatrical, that they'll hold everyone's attention as surely as if they were spellbound." Daphne's brow furrowed. "Dancers? You think they'll distract everyone with a dance?" Pyne nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Not just any dance, Mrs. St. John. This will be a grand performance at Lady Naomi's upcoming party. A performance so daring, so unexpected, that no one will dare to look away. It will be an opportune moment for you to make the switch." Daphne's heart fluttered. "But how does this help us? Surely it's too risky to attempt something like that in such a public space." "It's brilliant because it is risky," Pyne said, with a hint of a laugh in his voice. "Imagine it. The ballroom in full swing, people mingling, champagne flowing. And then, in the midst of it all, Claude and Madeleine burst onto the floor, drawing every eye in the room. Their movements will be so exquisite, so unexpected, that the crowd will be held captive. And while they perform, you, Mrs. St. John, will quietly slip the ring into its rightful place without anyone noticing." He paced back and forth, the excitement of the plan building. "You'll need to be precise, of course. You'll have no more than 5 minutes to make the swap. But with the distraction Claude and Madeleine will provide, no one will suspect a thing. The dance will be the perfect cover for your actions." Daphne listened, utterly captivated by the idea. It sounded audacious, but it also sounded perfect. A plan so simple yet so intricate. It was a rare thing to witness such a blend of artistry and precision. "And what happens after the ring is swapped?" she asked, her voice steady with growing resolve. "After that, we make sure to leave," Pyne replied, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Once the performance is over, all eyes will be on the dancers, lost in the applause. We'll vanish into the night, with the ring securely returned, and no one the wiser. The plot will be untangled, and your reputation and your debts will be saved. Daphne's eyes widened in realization. She could hardly believe it, but she also knew Pyne had thought of everything. She could see it now. The dancers twirling, the audience mesmerized, and in the shadows she would reclaim what she'd lost. But then, just as she was about to speak, Pyne paused and turned his sharp gaze to her. "Of course," he said coolly, "to hear is always the possibility that someone might be watching. You see, Mrs. St. John, the most dangerous thing about these grand plans is that they often work too well. If we're not careful, we might draw the attention of people we don't want to notice us." Daphne's breath caught. Who else would be watching? Pyne's smile remained, but it was edged with an unsettling calm. "Let's just hope we can pull this off before someone realizes exactly what we're doing." The room seemed to close in as Daphne processed his words. There was no turning back now. This was the only chance she had to right her wrong. But she couldn't help but wonder, was Pyne as clever as he seemed, or had he just woven an even more intricate web than she could see? Would they make it through the night without being caught? And just as the thought crossed her mind, a soft knock echoed from the door. Pyne's eyes flickered to it, his expression unreadable. "We'll see if we're in time," he murmured. "And Mrs. St. John, let's hope the game doesn't turn against us before it even begins." The night of Lady Naomi Dortheimer's party had arrived, and the atmosphere in the grand ballroom was electric. It was a scene fit for a Parisian gala. The air thick with the scent of fresh flowers, the soft clinking of glasses, and the hushed murmur of high society mingling with one another. Glistening chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Yet beneath the polished facade of wealth and elegance, something far more dangerous was afoot. Daphne stood at the edge of the room, her pulse racing as she watched the clock tick down. Pyne's plan was unfolding just as he'd promised, but the tension in her chest refused to dissipate. She wasn't a thief by nature. This wasn't her world, and tonight, the weight of her own deceit felt heavier than ever. The guests seemed oblivious to her anxiety, wrapped up in the spectacle, but Daphne couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that at any moment, everything could go wrong. Across the room, Claude Luttrell, dressed in a sharp tuxedo, stood confidently beside Madeleine de Serres. They were preparing for their performance, a carefully rehearsed routine that would serve as the perfect distraction. Claude's role tonight was crucial. He wasn't just any dancer. He was Jules, the legendary dancer everyone had heard of but few had ever seen. His reputation preceded him, and that was the key. No one in that room would dare take their eyes off him. The music began to swell, and the guests shifted in anticipation, eyes turning toward the stage. Lady Naomi, standing near the center of the room, beamed proudly, completely unaware of the plan unfolding under her nose. Pyne, ever the master of observation, was perched in a corner, surveying the room with quiet confidence. His expression betrayed nothing. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He'd orchestrated every moment of this, each detail meticulously designed to work in harmony. The time had come. As the first notes of the waltz filled the room, Claude and Madeleine took to the floor, their movements a perfect blend of grace and passion. The music swirled around them as they glided effortlessly, drawing the eyes of every guest. Claude, or Jules, was utterly captivating. His every movement was a carefully crafted work of art, each step precise yet flowing with an effortless elegance. The crowd was spellbound, their attention entirely consumed by the performance. The lights dimmed. It was subtle at first, a soft fading that seemed almost natural, as if the dimming was a part of the performance, but it was no accident. It was timed, perfectly executed, and everyone was too enchanted by the dancers to notice. Daphne's heart hammered in her chest. Her eyes darted around the room, making sure no one was watching too closely. As the lights continued to fade, a hush fell over the crowd. It was as if time itself had slowed. The music played on, but now it was an eerie, haunting sound, a perfect backdrop for what was about to unfold. In that brief moment of darkness, A small but decisive action occurred. Daphne, with hands trembling but precise, reached into her purse, feeling the cold, reassuring weight of the paste copy of the diamond ring. She slid it discreetly onto Lady Naomi's delicate glass of champagne, now on the edge of a nearby table, as the light shifted again just enough to mask the delicate movement. A barely perceptible exchange. The real diamond, hidden inside the sleeve of her dress, replaced the counterfeit. The sleight of hand was so seamless, so effortless, that even those with the sharpest eyes would have sworn nothing had changed. The real diamond was in her hand now, nestled safely against her palm. Her breath caught in her throat. It's done. It's really done. But as Daphne's fingers curled around the ring, her heart skipped a beat. For a brief second, she thought she saw a flash in the corner of the room, a flicker of movement that didn't belong. A shadow too distinct, too deliberate. She blinked and it was gone, but the feeling lingered. Could it have been nothing? Or was someone watching? The performance reached its crescendo, the dancers twirling in a final flourish. Applause erupted around the room, and with it, a strange, suffocating sense of finality. Everyone was captivated, lost in the wonder of the moment, and for the briefest of moments, Daphne allowed herself to exhale. But as the lights flickered back on and the crowd surged forward to congratulate the performers, something gnawed at her. She had the ring. The perfect heist had been pulled off, no one had noticed. But there was still something unsettling about the way the evening had unfolded. Pyne had warned her, after all, this was a game of high stakes, and it wasn't over yet. She glanced toward the door, where she'd last seen the shadows moving. Her stomach twisted. Had someone caught sight of her? Before she could think any further, Pyne's voice cut through the murmur of the guests, his calm tone somehow more chilling in the midst of the celebration. "Well done, Mrs. St. John. You've played your part beautifully." But as he spoke, his eyes flickered toward the far corner of the room, where a figure in a dark suit stood, watching them both. The figure was too still, too deliberate in its observation. And then, without a word, the figure turned and vanished into the crowd. Daphne's heart skipped a beat. Who was that? Was it someone Pyne had arranged, or was it a shadow of a threat they hadn't accounted for? The perfect plan had worked, or had it? The reveal. Unraveling the truth. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds of Parker Pyne's office, casting long shadows across the polished desk. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air as Pyne sat in his usual chair, leaning back with a contemplative expression. The room, once filled with the energy of Daphne's desperate plea for help, was now eerily quiet, as though the calm before a storm had settled over them both. Daphne St. John, or so she had called herself, entered with a sense of relief that should have been palpable, but something was different. The weight in her chest, heavy with the fear of discovery, hadn't lifted. If anything, it had only grown heavier. She held her head high, but her hands trembled slightly as they gripped the edges of her handbag. She had done it. She had pulled off the impossible. The ring had been replaced, the danger averted. Surely her troubles were now over. She felt herself breathe a little easier as she took her seat across from Pyne, ready to hear the satisfaction of a job well done. But Pyne's gaze was sharp, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no congratulatory smile, no sign of relief in his posture. His fingers tapped steadily on the armrest of his chair, as though he was pondering something far beyond the moment. "Daphne," he began, his voice calm but carrying an edge of something that made her pause. "I think it's time we had a little conversation." She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Something was off. His tone had changed, become more deliberate, and with that, a sense of unease crept in. "You've returned the ring, I presume?" Pyne asked, as if to confirm something she had already thought settled. "Yes," Daphne replied, trying to sound confident, but the words faltered on her tongue. "It's over now, isn't it? No one suspects anything." Pyne leaned forward, placing his fingertips together in a calculated motion. "No, Mrs. St. John," he said slowly. "You see, here is a bit of a problem. The ring you handed me, it was never the original diamond. It was the paste copy." Daphne's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing to process his words. What do you mean, I swapped it? Pyne's smile was thin, almost imperceptible. I know what you thought you swapped it with, but what you brought me was a well-crafted replica. The original diamond, however, is still with you. Her heart pounded as the realization hit her. Her hands went clammy, the blood draining from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught, tangled in her throat. Pyne was watching her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through her. He leaned back again, his gaze never wavering. And while we're on the subject of truths, here is something else you should know, Mrs. St. John. Your name isn't Daphne St. John, is it? She froze, the air thick with the weight of his words. For a moment, everything seemed to blur. The world around her spun, and she could barely focus as she felt the blood rush to her ears. Pyne's voice cut through the fog. Your real name is Ernestine Richards, isn't it? Secretary to Lady Naomi Dortheimer. The name hit her like a slap to the face. Ernestine Richards. It wasn't just a name, it was a life, a role she had carefully crafted, hiding in plain sight. But now, Pyne had unraveled it all. You, Daphne whispered, panic rising in her chest. How did you know? Pyne smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile one expects from someone offering a solution. It was the smile of someone who had already won. I know a great many things, Mrs. St. John. Or should I say, Ernestine. You orchestrated the entire scheme, didn't you? You planted the ring, played the role of the desperate woman who needed help. All in an effort to cover up your theft, and to ensure you wouldn't be caught. Daphne's eyes widened, her mouth going dry. The room seemed to close in on her as Pyne's words echoed through her mind. She had thought she was the one pulling the strings, manipulating everyone around her, but Pyne had been the one pulling her into a trap all along. Everything you told me, Pyne continued, was a carefully constructed lie. The poor, desperate widow with gambling debts, all fiction. The woman on the run from her past. A carefully rehearsed act. And now, the real diamond still lies within your grasp, hidden beneath layers of deceit. Daphne's heart raced, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She had thought she was escaping her past, but in reality, it had all been a setup. She wasn't the victim, she was the perpetrator, the mastermind of a crime far more intricate than she had ever realized. Pyne paused, watching her struggle to process it all. I must admit, Ernestine, I never expected this level of manipulation from you. But then again, I suppose I should have known better. It takes a clever mind to pull off a heist like this, and a far more dangerous one to think she could escape her fate. The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating, as Daphne's breath grew shallow. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Pyne's voice broke the silence again, cold and final. I haven't made you happy, as my advertisement promised, but I will make sure that you pay for your crimes, as I promised myself. The finality of his words sent a chill down her spine. She had played the game, but now the stakes were higher than ever. Pyne's plan had worked, and now she was caught in her own web of lies, with no way to untangle herself. Daphne's mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. Was there any way out of this? Could she somehow still salvage her future, or had she already sealed her fate? Her world was collapsing, and in the background, Pyne's sharp gaze watched her unravel. The questions hung in the air like a threat. What will happen now? Will she find a way out? Or will she pay the ultimate price for her deceit? The door clicked softly behind her as Pyne stood to leave, his presence hanging heavy in the room. Daphne was left there, alone with her guilt, her tangled lies and the looming certainty that her life would never be the same again. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths as Daphne bolted from Pyne's office, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the same relentless question. How had it all unraveled so quickly? Outside, the world seemed unchanged, bright, bustling, indifferent to the storm that raged inside her. The cool London breeze kissed her cheeks, but there was no relief. The wind only served to remind her of the tangled web she had woven and the consequences that were now closing in on her like an inescapable vice. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She had walked into Pyne's office a woman with a carefully constructed plan, confident that she could manipulate her way out of the mess she had created. But now, she was just a woman exposed her every lie, every deceit, laid bare for all to see. But what about the diamond? She thought desperately. What about the ring? Pyne may have won today, but surely he couldn't have everything, could he? The weight of her actions began to settle in, a crushing burden that threatened to choke her. It wasn't just about the ring anymore, or even the gambling debts that had driven her to such desperate lengths. It was the realization that she had betrayed herself, that the choices she had made had pushed her further and further into a labyrinth of lies. Her mind flickered to her husband, Henry, the man who, though careful and conscientious, had never truly known her. Could he ever look at her the same way now? Could she ever look at herself the same way? She stopped in the middle of the street, her breath ragged, as if the act of breathing itself had become an effort. She had been so sure that she could outrun her past, that she could fool everyone, including Pyne. But the truth always had a way of finding its way to the surface. It had found her now, and there was no hiding from it. Her footsteps faltered as she recalled Pyne's final words, his tone cold and final. "I haven't made you happy, as my advertisement promised. But I will make sure you pay for your crimes, as I promised myself." The truth, the one thing she had tried so hard to bury, had been exposed, and the consequences were coming. What Pyne would do next, she couldn't be sure. But she knew that the game was far from over. She turned down an alley, her hand trembling as she gripped her purse, her fingers brushing against the smooth edges of the false ring she had so desperately tried to pass off as the real one. Was there still a way out of this? Could she still turn back the clock, undo the mess she had made? The question lingered in her mind, but there was no clear answer. With each step, the past loomed larger, heavier, as if it were waiting for her to confront it. But how could she? How could she ever escape the shadow of what she had done? As the city buzzed around her, Daphne's thoughts remained trapped in the echo of Pyne's voice. She had thought she was the mastermind, the one pulling the strings, but now she was just a puppet tangled in the cords of her own making. And in that moment, she realized something even more terrifying than the guilt itself. Was there any escape from the lies she had built? Could she ever truly be free of the past she had so carefully constructed, or had she sealed her own fate, forever trapped in the labyrinth of her deceit? The question hung in the air like a shroud, unanswered, as Daphne disappeared into the maze of London's streets. For Pyne, the game was won. But for Daphne, the true cost of the truth was just beginning to unfold. Would she find redemption, or was she doomed to live in the shadow of her own lies forever? Only time would tell. But as the day drew to a close, the lingering uncertainty remained. Could anyone, after all, ever escape the consequences of their past? The answer, it seemed, was a far darker question than anyone could have imagined.